It was one of those Oxford afternoons that feel half forgotten, even while you stand inside them, the dimming sky loosening the last threads of rain as if reluctant to let the weather end on a decisive note. I had wandered into the quad of St. Othans, almost by instinct, following a faint curiosity about nothing in particular. A habit that has often led me toward trouble, or at least toward the sort of melancholy that clings to old stone the way ivy never quite can. The flagstones still held small mirrors of water, each reflecting a blurred honey-colored wall or the wavering silhouette of a passing undergraduate. I remember hearing them murmur a line of Latin to each other, poorly scanned, drifting on the damp air like a half-learned charm. "Venit hora," one of them said. "The hour comes." But the tone suggested they neither knew nor cared which hour that might be. I've often found that the wrong translation lingers longer in memory than the right one. The college smelled of wet leaves and the dust that rises from books left too long closed. Somewhere inside, a lecture must have just finished. I could hear that uncertain shuffling of bodies, deciding whether to linger or disperse. I kept walking toward the cloister, not because I intended to visit anyone, but because the afternoon seemed to ask for a witness. The rain had softened to a mere suggestion, brushing my coat, offering me the illusion of movement. It was then that I saw the poster. It hung slightly crooked beside the wooden door leading to the chapel, a thin sheet of paper already beginning to curl at its corners, the ink darkened by moisture. The lines were sparse. In memoriam, Dr. Adrian Kellaway, funeral service to be held Wednesday 4 p.m. The words "died" suddenly were tucked almost apologetically beneath his name, as if death itself were an administrative misstep the college wished to resolve quietly. Kellaway, a name I'd heard often enough in the common rooms of more scholarly men than myself. A classicist of some note, so they said, though notoriety seemed to cling to him as stubbornly as admiration. I had never met him. Yet the announcement stirred something in me, a small tug just beneath the ribs, the kind that arrives before understanding and leaves before one can interrogate it. I might have walked past if not for the student. He appeared beside me almost without sound, a thin figure wrapped in a gown too large for him, the hem darkened by rain. He glanced at the poster as though it were an accusation. "They put it up in a hurry," he murmured. "More to the air than to me. Shouldn't have been today. Shouldn't have been this week at all." There was no request for conversation, no expectation. His voice carried that brittle defensiveness of someone caught speaking a forbidden thought. When I asked him why the haste, he shifted his weight, eyes fixed on the puddle at his feet. "Best not to ask about it, sir. People don't want it talked about. Not inside these walls." Inside these walls? The phrase held an uncomfortable echo, the sort one hears when truth has been folded sharply and tucked between routine words. I asked nothing further. He walked away, shoulders tight, almost shivering though the rain had eased. I stood there rather longer than necessary, watching the chapel door where the poster fluttered like a quiet reprimand. Sudden deaths in Oxford were rarely as sudden as declared, and a college that discouraged discussion usually did so, not out of respect, but fear of the wrong question posed at the wrong time. The student's Latin returned to me then, unbidden. "Venit hora." The hour comes. The more I stood beneath the cloister arch, the more I felt that whatever hour Kellaway had reached, or been pushed toward, had not ended with his death. It lingered in the stones, in the rain, in the uneasy silence that settles after something important has been concealed too swiftly, and I, fool that I am, felt the old familiar stir. Curiosity, the beginning of trouble, the first step toward a lecture that would not end for some time. Lewis brought me the file the next morning with that mixture of apology and caution he often employed when the case in hand seemed either beneath my interest or painfully suited to it. He stood by my desk while I flipped through the thin sheaf of papers, their contents hardly thicker than the autumn light spilling through the window. "Kellaway," Male. 58. Found in his rooms by a porter during morning rounds. The cause of death described as accidental, though the phrasing lacked conviction. When I looked up, Lewis was watching me with that patient expression of his, the one that suggested he knew better than to assume I would leave the matter alone. He said something about the college wanting the whole business wrapped up. Quick inquiry, quick closure, quicker silence. The words slipped into my memory without adornment, landing in the same quiet place where the students' anxious comments had settled the day before. I told Lewis we might as well pay St. Athan's another visit, though I heard the weariness in my own voice. Even curiosity has its seasons, and mine felt perpetually late. The college greeted us with its usual restraint. Damp stone, the smell of chalk, a faint echo of footsteps that belonged to no one in sight. As we stepped into the quad, I noticed the chapel door stood slightly ajar, as though someone had entered in haste or left without finishing a thought. A scrap of black cloth lay on the threshold. I bent to brush my fingers against it. A torn fragment of a scholar's gown, the edges frayed unevenly, not cut but wrenched. Lewis remarked that anyone could lose a bit of cloth in a place like this, but the remark felt unsteady, like a tune played a fraction off key. Inside the porter's lodge, the acting master received us with a polished courtesy that failed to hide his discomfort. He spoke of Kellaway the way one mentions an eccentric relative, with affection seasoned by exasperation. There had been disagreements, he said. Minor ones? Academic only. Tempers flare in any intellectual field. We asked about the night of the death. He cleared his throat and avoided my eyes. A fall, he repeated, as though the word might settle the matter by sheer monotony. But something in his tone made me look again at the torn cloth still in my hand. I asked whether Kellaway had been wearing his academic gown that night. The master frowned, surprised by the question. No, of course not. Kellaway never wore his gown outside ceremonies. Vanity, perhaps, or stubbornness. In any case, the gown was found neatly hung in his wardrobe, untouched. The implication hovered uninvited. The scrap I held belonged to someone else. Lewis asked about witnesses, though we both suspected there wouldn't be any. And indeed there weren't. Or rather, there was one. But his statement raised more questions than comfort. A senior fellow claimed to have glimpsed Kellaway crossing the quad at a time that contradicted the official timeline. The master dismissed it as poor memory. I've learned that poor memory is often a convenient disguise for inconvenient truth. We left the lodge and wandered toward the staircase leading to Kellaway's rooms. The corridor felt colder than the weather allowed, carrying a hush that made the floorboards creak louder beneath our steps. On the landing, a faint smell of old paper drifted from a half-open door. I paused. The scent felt wrong. Not because it didn't belong, but because it felt too strong, as though someone had disturbed a shelf of forgotten volumes recently and hastily. Inside, the room was tidy enough, though the tidiness felt curated rather than habitual. A small desk lamp glowed without warmth. Papers lay stacked, but not naturally. A hand unfamiliar with the order had arranged them. Lewis remarked on the absence of a handwritten note, though nothing about Kellaway suggested a man inclined toward orderly farewells. I drifted toward the window and noticed a faint smear on the sill. A shallow arc, the residue of something dragged or caught. A robe? A sleeve? Perhaps nothing. But the torn scrap in my pocket felt heavier then. I stood in the quiet and let the details rest in the uneasy chamber behind thought. A gown, not Kellaway's. A sighting after death. A room tidied by someone who didn't understand the man who once lived in it. Oxford has always been fond of masks. And some are stitched not with fabric, but fear. The case, it seemed, had already begun to speak. I have often believed that grief, when genuine, carries a certain asymmetry. It bends the face, loosens the voice, alters the rhythm of a person's movements in ways no rehearsal can imitate. And perhaps because I have spent so long studying the silences of Oxford, I've also learned to notice when such a symmetry is missing. It was missing from all four of them that afternoon. Lewis and I began our interviews in the senior common room, where the fire struggled against the damp and the faint perfume of old paper lingered in every corner. The Fellow of Classics was the first to greet us, though greeting might be the wrong term for the way he stiffened when our presence interrupted his solitary reading. He spoke of Kellaway with a poise that felt curated rather than sorrowful. A brilliant man, he said, though not always easy. I watched his fingers tap a steady beat against the leather arm of his chair. It was too steady. Measured grief, like measured affection, rarely convinces. As he spoke, I noticed a crossword folded beside him on the table. One clue had been circled, mourner uncertain about final act at us 8. A coincidence, perhaps. But the timing made the ink feel more deliberate than accidental. When I asked whether he had seen Kellaway recently, he paused just half a second too long before answering. Only at meetings, only in passing, only enough to exchange the usual courtesies. Each only felt like another stone placed on a wall he wanted to keep intact. The bursar arrived next, bustling with a nervous energy utterly unsuited to the solemn backdrop of the room. His condolences sounded rehearsed, as though he had practiced them in the mirror before walking down the hall. He assured us the college wished only for discretion, unity, and respect. Respect often hides its opposite. While he spoke, his eyes drifted repeatedly toward the window, as if expecting someone to appear on the quad below, or perhaps fearing they might. When Lewis asked about the college accounts Kellaway had recently reviewed, the bursar's hands stilled. The silence that followed felt oddly heavy, like a pause in music where the next note refuses to arrive. The librarian entered quietly, almost ghost-like, her expression composed in a way that resisted interpretation. She spoke softly, her voice threaded with an ambiguity I couldn't quite place. Neither sorrow nor relief, neither fondness nor disdain. She claimed she had admired Kellaway's scholarship, though a faint hesitation suggested otherwise. Her gaze rested on a distant shelf rather than on either of us. When I asked whether she had seen him the evening before his death, she answered promptly, almost too promptly. I felt something tighten beneath the surface of her reply, some private memory she had no intention of sharing. Last came the graduate student, the only one who looked genuinely unsettled by our presence. She clutched a notebook with such force that her knuckles paled. She spoke of Kellaway's brilliance, but there was a tremor in her description, a tension suggesting admiration tangled with something sharper. She said he had been critical of her work lately. She said it with a brittleness that made the room seem colder. When I asked whether she had seen him near the chapel on the night he died, she lowered her eyes and answered too quickly to be unconsidered. No, certainly not. She had been in her rooms all night, reading. She offered the alibi before either of us had requested one. When the four had gone, the fire continued its weak struggle, casting a faint glow over the empty chairs they had left behind. Lewis looked at me with that slight tilt of his head, an expression asking whether anything of substance had been gleaned. I couldn't offer him clarity, only impressions, only fragments. Yet it was those fragments that unsettled me most. They had mourned Kellaway, each in their own way, but they had mourned him incorrectly. Not too little, not too much. Simply wrong. Kellaway's rooms lay at the top of a narrow staircase that had surrendered long ago to the weary groan of old wood. I remember climbing it with Lewis behind me, the two of us moving in that unspoken agreement of silence that settles when a space seems to anticipate our arrival. The corridor was dim, lit only by the last thread of daylight slipping through a window at the far end. It smelled faintly of chalk and old tobacco, the scent of a life lived mostly indoors, among paper and ghosts. The door to Kellaway's rooms had been left unlocked for our inspection, though the latch resisted as though embarrassed to open again after witnessing something it could not forget. Inside, the room felt tidier than any academic space ought to be. Not neat by habit, but neat in the way a stranger tidies when they don't know what belongs where. Books arranged with too much symmetry, papers stacked in a way that suggested respect rather than familiarity. Even the chair seemed moved a fraction away from the desk, as if someone had attempted to restore order without understanding its original shape. Lewis wandered toward the window, hands in the pockets, while I stepped closer to the desk. A Greek lexicon lay open, but the page struck me as peculiar, not for its contents, but its irrelevance. No student or scholar of Kellaway's caliber would have left it open to such a pedestrian entry. It felt like someone had opened it simply to feign studiousness, a mask of scholarship rather than the thing itself. It was then I noticed the footnote, not in the lexicon, but in one of Kellaway's papers resting beside it. A modest article draft, handwritten in his neat, angular script. The footnote mark, a tiny number, pointed to a reference that did not exist. Or rather, it existed without the article it was meant to annotate. A ghost of a citation, a footnote missing its parent. I stared at it, sensing a disturbance far subtler than any staged tidiness could conceal. Lewis asked whether I had found something, and I heard my own voice answer distantly, as if I were speaking from a narrower corridor inside myself. Only a fragment, but fragments often speak more clearly than the whole. I held the paper to the light. There, faint though unmistakable, was an erased line beneath the footnote. A smudge of graphite, hurriedly rubbed away. Someone had removed whatever Kellaway had intended to reference. But why erase a footnote in a draft no one else should have seen? Why fear the smallest annotation? I set it down and crossed the room toward the wardrobe. Inside hung Kellaway's academic gown, precisely as the acting master had described. Unworn, uncreased. I ran my fingers lightly along the collar and felt a stiffness he would never have tolerated. It had been cleaned recently, too recently. The fibers too obedient for a garment of its age. Perhaps it was nothing, but I have never trusted coincidences in Oxford, particularly when they congregate around the edges of death. Lewis drew my attention to a photograph on the shelf, a small, worn image tucked behind a row of books. Kellaway stood beside another man, both dressed in the same ceremonial garb. The other man's face, however, had been scratched out. Not in haste, but with an unsettling deliberation. The lines were careful, controlled. An erasure meant to wound without disfiguring the rest of the picture. I asked Lewis whether he recognized the background, the hall behind them. He didn't, but I did after a moment's hesitation. It was the old dining hall, the one rarely used except for ceremonies. A place where old friendships either mended or finally gave up pretending. I slipped the photograph into my pocket without comment. Some truths are easier to carry privately. As we left the room, I paused on the threshold, feeling that faint tremor that comes when the smallest detail shifts into view. A footnote missing its article, a gown cleaned too well, a photograph amended with quiet violence. Oxford hides its secrets in the smallest marks. It is always the detail meant to be forgotten that begins to whisper first. Rumors move differently in Oxford. They do not travel in straight lines or reach their destination promptly. They drift, pausing at every doorway, waiting for someone to pretend not to hear them. By the afternoon of that same day, the whispers surrounding Kellaway had already begun to tilt toward the inevitable themes: resentment, rivalry, and that most predictable of academic currencies: affection misplaced in the wrong direction. Lewis and I returned to the college library, a place where the air seemed composed of equal parts silence and dust. The librarian was at her desk, arranging returns with the precision of someone restoring order to a part of herself. She asked if we had found anything of concern, though her tone suggested she hoped we had not. I told her merely that contradictions had surfaced. Contradictions often do. I added, and hers was the only expression that flickered, just briefly, as if an old memory had nudged her ribs. She mentioned that Kellaway had been working late in the reading room in the weeks before his death. He preferred solitude, she said, though the phrasing carried a subtle resentment. Solitude chosen is admirable. Solitude imposed is not. I asked whether anyone else had reason to seek him out after hours. She hesitated, a pause so thin it might have been mistaken for breath, and replied that scholars often cross paths unexpectedly. The words were tidy, their meaning was not. After she left us to our search, Lewis remarked that she seemed the sort of woman Kellaway might have both admired and aggravated. I didn't respond. Admiration and aggravation are often the same emotion expressed at different temperatures. We moved between the shelves, the floorboards creaking beneath my steps in a way that felt almost communicative. On one of the side tables lay a recent copy of the Times, folded neatly to the crossword. My eye drifted to a clue I had not noticed earlier. Lover with hidden motive, 6. Someone had solved it, but scratched out the answer so forcefully the paper had torn. Lewis asked what I thought it had been. I didn't answer. I knew. But knowing and confirming are separate pursuits, and I have never believed in placing conclusions where only shadows belong. We found the graduate student in a small alcove, pretending to study. She startled when she saw us, her notebook snapping shut. Her eyes darted toward the stacks behind her, as if expecting someone to emerge. I asked whether she had worked with Kellaway recently. She said he had grown critical, demanding, impossible to please. Yet the tremor in her voice suggested more than academic frustration. She spoke of an argument overheard in the hall a fortnight ago. Kellaway and the Fellow of Classics, their voices low but sharp. Academic disagreements, she insisted. Nothing more. Nothing more is a phrase that rarely means what it claims. When she left, Lewis murmured that she was frightened. I told him fear in Oxford is rarely about crime. More often, it is about exposure, of inadequacy, of longing, of mistakes made under the dim light of ambition. We next sought the Fellow of Classics, finding him in the cloister, pacing under the cold arch like a man rehearsing the version of himself he wished others to believe. He greeted us with a cordial stiffness, said he had heard we were making progress. I replied that progress was a misleading word in investigations. One can move constantly without advancing at all. He smiled, too quickly, and asked whether the bursar had said anything about the college's finances. The question felt misplaced. The tone felt rehearsed. He added, unprompted, that the librarian and Kellaway had once been close. Very close, he said before correcting himself. Colleagues. Nothing improper. His correction came too late. The wrong note struck after the song had ended. By the time Louis and I stepped back into the drizzle collecting in the quad, the whispers had settled into a pattern. A triangle here, a rivalry there, a past affection that may have tangled into something unmanageable. Yet each story contradicted the next. Every motive pointed neatly toward someone and too neatly toward no one. I remember thinking then that the truth, if it lived anywhere, lived not in the affairs themselves, but in the spaces between them. The gaps where ambition pressed against desire, and desire against fear. Oxford has never hidden its wars well. It merely whispers them through corridors and expects the dead to carry the blame. I've always found the river to be the most deceitful place in Oxford. It looks gentle from a distance, a ribbon of dull silver looping through quiet colleges and tidy lawns, yet it carries every discarded secret like a second current beneath the surface. Perhaps that is why the porter who found the gown sounded so uneasy when he telephoned Lewis. A wet gown, he said, washed up near the old boathouse. No owner. No explanation. Just cloth where cloth had no business being. Lewis and I reached the river bank in the grey hush of late afternoon. The sky hung low, thick with unspoken weather, and the path beneath our feet smelled faintly of damp earth and decaying leaves. A faint breeze rattled the reeds with a nervous insistence, as though they were eager to speak if only someone would listen correctly. The porter had left the gown draped over a wooden bench. It looked diminished there, as though the river had stripped it of authority. I lifted a corner of the wet fabric, feeling the cold weight of it pull downward like a reluctant confession. "This isn't Kellaway's," I said. "Too new. Too light." Lewis nodded. The college crest was subtly different, the stitching modern. A scholar of lesser seniority, perhaps, or someone who wanted anonymity. What struck me first was the scent. A faint trace of cologne clung to the fabric. Something foreign, lightly floral, too delicate for the average academic. I'd come across it once in a case long past, worn by a man who believed elegance could distract from deceit. Memory. It has a way of resurfacing when least expected, tugging you back toward things you thought you had outgrown. Lewis speculated about students drinking by the river, some careless prank. But the cloth bore no laughter, no recklessness. It felt chosen, placed, abandoned with intention rather than impulse. I asked the porter whether he had seen anyone near the river the previous night. He hesitated, as though testing the strength of his own recollection. "Only the graduate student," he said. She'd passed through just after dusk, walking quickly, head down as if avoiding the sight of her own reflection in the water. I asked if she had carried anything. He shook his head too quickly. His uncertainty was not about what he saw, but about what he feared he hadn't. As we walked along the bank, I noticed something near the reeds. A faint indentation, the shape of a heel pressed into softened mud. It pointed not toward the path, but toward the water. A single step taken by someone who either changed their mind or never intended to continue. Lewis crouched to inspect it, but the river had already begun to reclaim its outline. I warned him not to trust impressions too easily. Rivers are skilled at constructing illusions. Further along, we found a thin branch snapped at an odd angle, the break too clean for wind or animal. Someone had used it to steady themselves, or to push something away. Lewis looked at me as though expecting a revelation. None came. Deduction, in its earliest form, is more about discomfort than clarity. We followed the bank until the path curved back toward the college. As we approached the old boathouse, I felt the subtle pull that accompanies a memory not yet fully formed. Something about the building seemed wrong, not visibly. Architecturally, it was the same weathered structure it had always been. But there was an absence, a sense that something normally present had been removed. It took a moment before I recognized it. The padlock on the side door, usually rusted into resignation, had been recently disturbed. The metal gleamed faintly where someone had scraped away the surface corrosion. Inside, perhaps, someone had hidden more than a gown, or retrieved more than they cared to admit. Lewis suggested we return with proper clearance, and I agreed, though reluctantly. I glanced once more at the river. The water moved with indifferent persistence, carrying fragments of the world that no one bothered to claim. A gown abandoned, a scent misplaced, a heel print resisting the river's pull. Oxford has always been tidy on the surface, but its untidiness sinks to the bottom, waiting patiently for someone foolish enough to wade in. The librarian found me the next morning in the cloister, though she pretended the encounter was accidental. Oxford has perfected the art of orchestrated chance. She carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, its edges softened by indecision. She said she had meant to deliver it to me sooner, but hadn't been certain whether I should see it at all. Her voice trembled not from fear, but from the strain of someone trying too carefully to sound composed. I told her that uncertainty was often more revealing than clarity. She didn't answer, only extended the parcel with a deliberate gentleness. Inside was Kellaway's diary, or what remained of it. The spine had been removed entirely, leaving the pages loose and fragile, as though one more breath might scatter them across the grass. Someone had excised entries with surgical precision, not torn, removed, pages absent without violence, the sort of omission that suggests guilt refined into method. Lewis joined me as I sat at one of the stone benches, the diary spread like a wounded bird across my lap. The ink varied from bold to fading, the handwriting narrowing on some days, expanding on others. Human inconsistency preserved on paper. But even people who fluctuate have patterns, and Kellaway's pattern was linguistic. He loved prepositions. He placed them meticulously, as though each one were a step on a staircase he refused to ascend without checking its strength. I turned a page and noticed a sentence that jarred. Simple line about his lecture, ordinary enough, but the placement of a single word felt wrong, too casual for a man who prized precision. I read it again, then a third time. The inconsistency grew heavier, like a weight settling in the hollow beneath my ribs. Lewis asked what I had found. I told him the sentence had been altered. Not rewritten, but adjusted. A preposition swapped for another, smaller than the difference between intention and regret, yet unmistakably foreign to Kellaway's habits. Someone had rewritten that line long after he had written it. Lewis frowned, asking why anyone would bother to tamper with a diary. I reminded him that diaries often hold the truth. People are afraid to speak aloud. A misplaced word can turn accusation into affection, or certainty into speculation. The alteration was not clumsy. It was careful. Too careful. The librarian had lingered nearby under the pretext of sorting returned books on an outdoor cart. She avoided looking in our direction, but her hands betrayed her. They moved with the precision of someone accustomed to order, yet trembled imperceptibly whenever a hardback brushed her fingertips. I watched her without letting her know I watched. Her grief had seemed ambiguous before, but now it carried a shadow of responsibility. Not necessarily for a crime, but for proximity to one. I asked Lewis whether Kellaway had kept personal correspondence in his rooms. He said there had been letters, though none of significance. Letters of no significance are usually the first ones I want to read. But it was the diary that mattered now. Or rather, the absences in it. One fragment mentioned a meeting in the old dining hall. The same hall from the photograph I'd taken from his shelf. A conversation hinted at, but never described. And then a missing page where the next entry should have been. As though the moment between them was intolerable even to record. I turned another page and found a faint indentation where words had once been pressed. Someone had removed the page but forgotten the pressure their hand left behind. I traced the shallow marks with my thumb. The remnants suggested more than the words themselves could have conveyed. A date, a name, a hesitation. Lewis asked what it meant. I told him meaning often hides in the empty spaces rather than the written ones. He shook his head but didn't argue. When the wind shifted, the loose pages fluttered as though eager to escape. I held them still and felt a sudden, quiet certainty. Not of guilt, but of entanglement. Affection, resentment, ambition. These were threads woven with too much force to remain neatly aligned. A diary without its spine cannot stand. Neither can the stories people try to build upon omissions. The senior common room was almost empty when Lewis and I entered, its silence thickened by the faint scent of cooling tea and the dusty perfume of polished wood. A fire burned half-heartedly in the grate, giving off more light than warmth. It was the sort of room that seemed to expect conclusions, as though the portraits on the wall waited for some declaration to anchor their vigilance. Perhaps that was why I felt a certain reluctance, even as the pieces of a tolerable explanation began to arrange themselves in my mind. For the first time since Kellaway's death, the narrative seemed to behave. the bursar's darting glances, his anxious movements, the financial records he had dismissed too readily. I remembered the hesitation when we questioned him about the college accounts, the way he had watched the quad as though waiting for absolution. It was tempting, dangerously tempting, to let that image harden into certainty. Lewis asked whether I finally saw a shape to the matter, and I heard myself admit that I did. I spoke of money unaccounted for, of a scholar who might have stumbled upon discrepancies buried beneath polite arithmetic, of a confrontation carried out in a corridor where secrets echo too easily. I suggested, cautiously, yet with growing conviction, that Kellaway had confronted the bursar, and that the fall had been less accidental than choreographed by panic. Lewis listened without interrupting. His silence had weight, not agreement. I walked toward the hearth, the heat brushing my shins in soft pulses. The gown found on the river bank, the erased diary pages, the photograph with its scratched-out face. They still troubled me, but I had begun to believe they might be peripheral, the way irrelevant clues often cling to the edges of an investigation like stubborn ivy. The bursar, anxious and oddly rehearsed, offered a simpler path. Simplicity is seductive, especially when one grows tired of labyrinths. Lewis finally spoke, asking whether I was certain. I told him certainty is a luxury we rarely earn, but probability was tilting in one direction. Even as I said it, I felt a faint unease, like the hesitation before writing an answer in a crossword only to realize the clue contains a trick. The feeling brushed against my thoughts but did not settle. We summoned the bursar, who arrived with the expression of a man convinced that inconvenience constitutes injustice. He sat opposite us, fussing with his cufflinks. I asked him about the account again. He deflected. I pressed. His composure frayed in small increments. The twitch of a jaw muscle, a sigh he tried to disguise as resignation. It was enough to persuade me that the false solution might in fact be true. He claimed ignorance. Though his denial lacked conviction, he insisted Kellaway had misunderstood something, though he gave no detail. When I suggested that Kellaway had intended to expose him, a tremor crossed his face, gone as quickly as it came. Lewis glanced at me, and the glance felt almost like approval. For a moment, I believed we had reached the verge of resolution. I believed it so thoroughly that I felt a strange lightness, like a man who has carried a heavy door only to realize someone else has been bearing its weight all along. I almost said as much to Lewis, and then the bursar ruined everything. He made a casual reference to an opera he claimed Kellaway had quoted the week before his death. The remark drifted out of him without calculation, a stray note in a room otherwise composed of caution. But Kellaway, I remembered, despised that particular opera. He had mocked it openly in a lecture I once attended years ago. He would never have quoted it. Not in jest, not in earnest. The discrepancy struck me harder than any confession could have, a lie spoken with the ease of truth. My false solution collapsed in an instant, brittle and hollow. Lewis saw my expression shift, though I said nothing. The bursar continued speaking, unaware that he had undone himself by trying too hard to sound informed. When he left, the fire crackled weakly, as though embarrassed to have illuminated a mistake rather than a revelation. Sometimes the wrong answer feels almost right, until the smallest detail betrays it. In that room, with the portraits watching like silent witnesses, I felt the case tilt again, deeper into ambiguity, and the uneasy freedom of not knowing returned to me like an unwelcome friend. It was well past dusk when I returned to the college library, though return may be the wrong word for the sort of pull that leads a man back to the scene of a doubt rather than the scene of a crime. The building seemed larger at night, as though the shadows had borrowed space the daylight politely denied them. I walked through the main hall without switching on any lights, letting the soft spill of the reading lamps guide me toward the desk where I had left Kellaway's last letter. The silence felt too deliberate, like a pause held too long in conversation. The letter lay exactly where I'd placed it, though something about it felt altered. Not physically. Paper rarely betrays the secrets that cling to it. It was the sentence near the end, the one I'd read carelessly before, trusting the familiarity of Kellaway's hand. I read it again now, slowly, tracing each word with a kind of reverence I reserve only for the dead and the nearly understood. And then it struck me. A linguistic misstep so small that only a pedant or a grieving scholar might have noticed. Kellaway would never have used that particular verb with that particular construction. He was many things, but inconsistent was not one of them. His deviations were intentional, artful. This was neither. The sentence had been finished by someone else. Lewis had mentioned earlier that the letter was found on the desk, half hidden under a book. Perhaps someone had assumed that completing the line would help craft a story of hurried despair. But the hand that had added those words had been too confident, too willing to mimic certainty. The mask slipped in syntax rather than sentiment. I heard a soft movement behind me. Not footsteps, just the air shifting as someone stepped into the doorway. The librarian. She looked strangely at ease in the dimness, as if she belonged more to the late hours than the living ones. She asked whether I always read letters that slowly. I told her some letters require slowing down, especially when the truth has been accelerated elsewhere. She didn't reply at first. Instead, she approached the reading table, her hand resting lightly on its edge. A small gesture, but there was tension in the knuckles, the kind that comes from rehearsing silence too carefully. She asked whether the diary had revealed anything of value. "Oh," I offered an evasive answer. She accepted it too quickly. When she reached for the lamp to adjust its angle, I noticed her sleeve brush against the stack of books, the faint scent of a French cologne lingering as she moved. It was the same scent I'd smelled on the gown by the riverbank. A delicate scent, one I doubted belonged to Kellaway, or to any of the college's more stoic men. I felt the discrepancy settle inside me like a cold coin. She asked whether the investigation was nearing its end. There was something fragile in the question, though the fragility felt feigned, like a mask worn more for habit than protection. I told her endings rarely announce themselves. She looked down then, and for a moment, a brief, unguarded moment, her composure thinned. The grief that surfaced wasn't grief. It was memory struggling to keep its shape. Lewis arrived a few minutes later, bringing with him the briskness of someone unused to libraries. He mentioned, in passing, that the graduate student had contradicted herself in her latest statement, a detail about her whereabouts that didn't match the porter's account. I nodded, though my mind was already drifting toward the photograph in my pocket, the scratched-out face, the ceremonial gown. Some truths reveal themselves not through confrontation, but through accumulation. A gesture here, a scent there, a misplaced word lingering too long in the air. When the librarian excused herself, her departure carried a lightness that felt wrong, as though she had set something down without meaning to. After she left, I read the letter once more, the incomplete sentence now glowing with quiet accusation. The mask had slipped, not violently, not theatrically, but with the soft inevitability of fabric loosening its hold. And suddenly, the entire case shifted, not toward clarity, but toward a truth that felt painfully human, a truth someone had tried very hard to rewrite. I remember the cloister being unusually still that evening, as though the air itself were holding its breath. The stone arches cast long shadows that stretched across the flagstones like tired limbs, and a faint drizzle softened every edge of the courtyard beyond. I had come not out of certainty, but out of a kind of resignation, the sense that the path, however unsteady, had begun to slope inevitably toward one person, and she must have known it because she was already there, standing with her back to me, her hand resting lightly against the cold stone. The librarian didn't turn when she heard my steps. She said she often came to the cloister when the college grew too loud in its dishonesty. Her voice carried a tired elegance, like someone speaking in a dream they weren't sure belonged to them. I told her the college had been whispering again. Not about her, not directly, but about things that pointed toward her more insistently than anyone intended. She asked what kinds of things. I mentioned the diary first, the missing pages, the altered line. She didn't flinch. I mentioned the scent on the gown found by the river. Her hand shifted fractionally against the wall, the movement almost lost in the gloom. I mentioned the photograph with its scratched-out face. That was when she finally turned to look at me. Her expression held neither fear nor denial. Instead, there was a quiet sorrow that did not ask for sympathy. She said that some memories become intolerable when preserved too faithfully, and that erasure is sometimes the only dignity left to the wounded. I told her I understood more than she thought. She replied that she hoped I didn't. We walked slowly beneath the arches, our steps echoing between us. She spoke of Kellaway in the past tense with a gentleness that betrayed an old intimacy, one worn thin by pride and misunderstanding. He had once trusted her with his work, his ambitions, his fragile vanity. She had trusted him with parts of herself she rarely acknowledged, and somewhere along the line, trust had curdled into accusation. She paused beneath a lantern whose light flickered unevenly, as though reluctant to illuminate what came next. She said Kellaway had discovered an error in one of her early translations, an error she had hidden from everyone, including herself, by simply refusing to revisit the text. Scholars build their masks differently, she said. We stitch ours from footnotes and interpretations. Once a single thread unravels, the whole garment threatens collapse. When Kellaway confronted her in the old dining hall, she said, he had not meant cruelty, but he had spoken with the absolute conviction of a man who believed knowledge alone justified pain. She told him she would correct it. He insisted she confess it. She said she needed time. He said time was complicity. What followed was not premeditated, at least not in the way people define intent. She reached for him, perhaps in anger, perhaps in desperation. He stepped back. The fall was brief, brutal, and irreversible. I watched her speak the words without embellishment, each sentence ironed flat by exhaustion. She didn't cry, she didn't plead, she simply allowed the memory its truth. Lewis arrived part way through her quiet explanation, though he remained a respectful distance away, sensing the delicacy of what was unfolding. The librarian noticed him and smiled faintly, as though relieved, to see an honest witness. She said she had tried to make the scene appear accidental, not to evade guilt, but to soften it. For the college, for Kellaway, for the version of herself she could no longer inhabit. I asked why she had written the final line of the letter. She said the sentence had felt unfinished, and that she could not bear to leave his last words half-born. Her voice wavered then, only slightly. When she finished speaking, she placed her hand on the wall again, almost as if asking the stone for permission to remain upright. Lewis approached, his face carrying none of the judgment she seemed to expect. She thanked him anyway, with a sincerity that unsettled me. As we escorted her out of the cloister, the drizzle had begun to fall in earnest, erasing our footprints as quickly as they formed. Some truths do not shatter the silence. They slip quietly into it, like a mask lowering itself at last. I've never liked the mornings that follow a confession. They carry a strange vacancy, as though the world has stepped away from itself and left only the echo of the night before. When I awoke, the memory of the cloister still clung to me. The smell of damp stone, the tremor in her voice, the final collapse of a truth she had been holding upright far too long. I found myself walking back to St. Athan's without any particular intention, drawn by the peculiar heaviness that lingers when a case has concluded in form, but not in feeling. The college seemed quieter than usual. Even the pigeons on the chapel roof had settled into an unusual stillness. as though they too sensed the residue of something raw. Lewis had gone ahead to handle the necessary procedures, leaving me free to wander the quad in that restless way a mind sometimes requires when the heart has too much to consider. I ended up in the library again, almost involuntarily. The reading lamps cast pools of amber light across the tables, and for a moment I imagined Kellaway sitting at one of them, hunched over a text, annotating lines with the fierce precision that had defined him. I walked to the desk where the letter lay, its edges slightly curled from handling. I sat down and unfolded it slowly. The original handwriting ended abruptly, trailing off mid-thought. I traced the point where Kellaway's pen had been lifted, the break between breath and silence. Then I followed the continuation, the falsely completed sentence written by her hand, elegant but wrong in rhythm. I had noticed the discrepancy before, but now it held a different weight. It was no longer evidence. It was grief set down in borrowed ink. Lewis appeared at the doorway, asking whether I needed more time. I told him time was the only thing I understood less with each passing year. He nodded, perhaps recognizing that some questions are rhetorical even when they sound earnest. He mentioned the librarian was waiting quietly in her office, not protesting, not pleading. She had asked only that someone return the diary to her. I told him I would take it myself. When he left, I read the letter once more. A line caught my attention, not because of its content, but because of its cadence. Kellaway had written a phrase that, when repeated aloud, carried a faint echo of something familiar, an old poem, perhaps, or a line from a lecture he had once given. I whispered it to myself, letting the rhythm settle, and realized it matched a marginal note in his diary, one written long before the tension with her had begun. A coincidence or a quiet attempt at reconciliation? I couldn't know. Some truths simply resist retrieval. The corridors felt colder as I carried the diary toward her office. The floorboards creaked beneath my steps, each one releasing a sigh of age. When I reached her door, I hesitated, not out of fear, but respect, for the kind of sorrow that refuses theatrics. I knocked gently. She sat at her desk, hands folded, the morning light catching the strands of gray at her temple. She thanked me before I even handed her the diary, as though my arrival alone had confirmed something she had been bracing herself to accept. She asked whether I believed Kellaway had meant to forgive her. I told her forgiveness is rarely explicit. It lives between words, not inside them. She nodded, absorbing the answer without challenge. She placed the diary in a drawer with a careful tenderness that unsettled me. She said she had rewritten the letter's final line because she could not bear to leave his last thought unfinished. Not to absolve herself, but to honor the part of him she had once loved. The part that demanded precision, completion, closure. I understood, though understanding offered no comfort. When I left her office, the quad was filling with the beginnings of a new day. Students crossing paths, footsteps scattering in different directions, life resuming with its usual indifference. I stood a moment longer than necessary, the letter still folded in my pocket. Some endings aren't resolutions. They are rewritings, attempts to soften what cannot be undone, to place gentleness where memory has grown sharp. Even the dead, I suppose, sometimes need their sentences finished. The morning of the funeral came with a pale, reluctant light, the kind that slips over rooftops as though uncertain whether the world deserves illumination. I found myself walking toward the small chapel at St. Athan's, almost against my will, each step carrying the weight of a decision made long before the case had begun. Funerals never suited me, though I have attended more than most men. They require a performance I have never mastered, a mask of decorum, a gesture of respect, a silence that feels prescribed rather than felt. Inside, the chapel smelled of old hymns and damp stone. A handful of fellows had gathered, scattered among the pews like punctuation marks in a sentence that no longer needed meaning. The acting master sat rigidly at the front, hands clasped, his face betraying the sort of solemnity that springs not from grief, but obligation. The graduate student hid herself in a corner, her eyes fixed on a hymn book she never opened. The fellow of classics leaned forward with a posture too polished for mourning. And the bursar, pale and trembling, wiped his glasses with the repetitive care of a man afraid to be seen clearly. The librarian did not attend. Lewis joined me near the back. He said she had declined quietly, leaving a message that grief sometimes requires distance. I told him distance was a form of grief. He nodded as though he had known it all along. The service began with a reading spoken in a tone that felt too crisp, too rehearsed, as if the speaker wished to finish before emotion had time to intervene. I listened without listening. My attention drifted toward the coffin, its polished wood reflecting a muted version of the stained glass above. There was something almost painfully understated about it. No flamboyant wreaths, no elaborate inscriptions. Just a name, a date, and a life folded neatly into finality. When the choir sang, softly, uncertainly, the notes dissolved in the cold air, leaving only a faint vibration behind. I found myself thinking of the diary, the erased pages, the lines she had rewritten, not as manipulation, not even as concealment, but as an act of mercy she had offered too late. A mask lifted, a mask replaced. After the service, the attendees drifted toward the graveyard behind the chapel. The grass there held the dew like tiny beads of hesitation. I stood slightly apart from the others as the coffin was lowered, the ropes slipping through gloved hands with the slow rhythm of inevitability. The acting master murmured something dutiful. The graduate student wiped a tear that felt too solitary for theatricality. The fellow of classics looked away, his jaw stiff. Only the bursar bowed his head as though trying to disappear inside himself. When it was done, the group dispersed without conversation. Death, once acknowledged, becomes an inconvenience to be folded into schedules. Lewis lingered beside me. He asked whether justice had been served. I told him justice was a word too rigid for the contours of human fault. Punishment and understanding rarely meet in the same place, and when they do, they part quickly. He asked whether I believed she had intended to kill Kellaway. I said intent is often an invention made after the fact, a story we impose to make sense of chaos. What mattered was the moment. One step backward, one surge of pride, one fear too sharp to contain. He let the answer settle, neither satisfied nor troubled, simply present. As Lewis walked back toward the quad, I remained by the fresh earth, the air trembling faintly with the final echoes of the morning's ceremony. I thought of the photograph with its careful erasure, of the gown on the river bank, of the letter's unfinished sentence, of the mask Kellaway wore in life. Brilliant, difficult, arrogant, lonely. And of hers, precise, composed, protective to the point of self-destruction. Oxford, with its centuries of polished stone, excels at hiding the fractures that define it. Every scholar, every student, every quiet caretaker wears some version of a mask, and the city sustains itself on the delicate balance between concealment and revelation. As I turned to leave, a faint breeze moved through the branches overhead, stirring the leaves with a sound like a whispered reminder, not of guilt or crime or even sorrow, but of the simple truth that no mask, however carefully crafted, survives the weight of being worn too long. And so Kellaway was buried, and with him, perhaps, the last illusion between two people who had once understood each other too well, and not well enough. The earth settled, the silence held, and the mask, whatever remained of it, slipped quietly into the ground beside him.